He said it on a Wednesday evening in the living room of the flat we shared. Not as a threat. Not in anger. In the quiet, certain tone of someone who has assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion they believe is final. He said, "Nobody is going to believe you." I was standing by the window. He was on the sofa. Between us was the conversation we had just had, the one where I had finally said out loud the thing I had been carrying for 8 months. The thing I had gathered slowly and carefully and documented with the specific precision of someone who had understood, somewhere in the middle of everything, that documentation was going to matter. I had told him what I knew, what I had, what I intended to do with it. He had listened to all of it. And then he had said those 5 words with the calm authority of someone who has never once been wrong about what people choose to believe and who does not expect this time to be different. Nobody is going to believe you. I looked at him for a long moment. I did not say anything. Not because I had nothing to say. Because I had already understood something he had not. I understood that the 5 words he had just delivered as a threat were actually the last mistake he would ever make in my presence. My name is Riva. And this is the story of the year I said nothing. And everything that happened when the truth started speaking for itself. I need to tell you who Caspian was before I tell you what he did. Because this story only makes sense if you understand that he was not obviously dangerous. He was not the kind of person who announced himself. Caspian was 38. He ran a mid-sized property development firm that he had built over 12 years from a single project to a company with 14 staff and a portfolio that the local business press covered with the specific admiration reserved for self-made success stories. He was confident and articulate, and had the particular quality of presence that makes rooms orient themselves around you without quite knowing it is happening. He was also the most skilled manipulator I have ever encountered. I do not use that word lightly or with the inflation that sometimes accompanies it. I mean it in the precise, clinical sense. He was skilled at managing perception, at constructing narratives, at ensuring that the version of reality that reached other people was the version he had designed rather than the version that existed. He had been doing it long before I met him. I understood this only after I started looking. Only after 8 months of gathering and documenting and piecing together the picture that he had spent years ensuring nobody had the full view of. The picture was not complicated once you could see it complete. He had been taking things from people for a long time. Money. Credit. Opportunities. The specific, quiet theft of someone who never leaves fingerprints because they have learned how to make the victims doubt their own perception. I had been one of those victims. And then I had stopped being one. I met Caspian at a professional event 2 years before the Wednesday evening. I worked in financial compliance, a role that required precision and documentation and the specific quality of noticing discrepancies that other people miss because they are not looking for them. I had been good at that quality for my entire career. What I had not applied it to in the first year of being with Caspian was him. This is the thing about proximity and love. They compromise the perceptual faculties that function perfectly at a distance. I had spent years identifying irregularities in financial systems, and I had not identified the most significant irregularity in my own life because I had been too close to it and too invested in the alternative interpretation. The alternative interpretation was that Caspian was exactly what he presented himself as. Successful. Principled. A man whose confidence came from genuine competence rather than from the careful management of what other people were allowed to see. I had believed that interpretation for 12 months. The unraveling began with a phone call I was not supposed to hear. I had come home early from work on a Tuesday afternoon. Caspian was in his study with the door closed. The window to the garden was open because it had been warm. I was standing in the garden when I heard his voice through the window. He was on the phone. He was describing a situation involving a former business partner named Griffin in terms that did not match the version of that situation he had told me. Not slightly. Fundamentally. I stood in the garden and listened. And the compliance officer in me, the one I had not been applying to my own life, woke up completely. I did not confront him that day. I want to be precise about that because the decision not to confront him immediately is the decision that changed everything that followed. I had spent my career learning that confrontation without documentation is a conversation. Documentation without confrontation is a case. I understood instinctively, standing in that garden with the sound of his voice still in the air, that what I needed was not a conversation. What I needed was a case. So I went back inside. I made tea. When Caspian came out of his study, I asked how his day was going. He said well. I said good. We had dinner. I listened to him talk and I was warm and present and entirely, completely somewhere else. I started the next morning. 8 months of looking. Careful, systematic, patient looking, the kind that does not announce itself, that moves in the spaces between the ordinary life, that accumulates evidence the way water accumulates in a vessel. Slowly, without drama, until it is full. I spoke to Griffin. Not directly, not yet. Through a mutual professional contact who knew us both and who said, when I asked careful questions about the partnership dissolution, things that confirmed what I had heard through the garden window. I found documents. Financial records from the company that were accessible to me as Caspian's partner in the administrative sense, invoices, correspondence. The paper trail of decisions that had been described to investors and partners one way and had actually proceeded another. I found 2 other people. Former colleagues of Caspian's whose departures from his orbit had been explained by him in terms that did not survive contact with the actual people involved. 8 months. Careful and quiet and entirely invisible. And then I had what I needed. The Wednesday evening was the end of the gathering phase and the beginning of everything else. I had chosen Wednesday deliberately. Not a Friday would have given him the weekend to mobilize. Not a Monday would have been lost in the noise of the working week beginning. Wednesday, the middle. Enough working days on either side for what I had set in motion to proceed without interference. I told him what I had. In order. Precisely. The way I presented compliance findings, without emotion, with specific reference to specific evidence, with the clarity of someone who has spent 8 months making sure every piece is exactly where it needs to be before the presentation begins. I told him about Griffin, about the 2 former colleagues, about the financial records, about the investors who had been given information that did not match the company's actual position. I told him I had already sent a preliminary report, not to the press, not to anyone public, but to the regulatory body that had oversight of the kind of financial conduct I had documented, and to Griffin's legal representative, and to one of the investors, a woman named Dara, who had been asking questions about the company for 6 months and to whom the documentation I had sent would provide significant answers. I told him this quietly, without anger, with the specific composure of someone who has already done the work and is simply delivering the summary. He listened to all of it. Then he said, "Nobody is going to believe you." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I picked up my bag. I walked out of the flat. I did not look back. I had arranged everything before Wednesday evening. This is the part that people find most difficult to understand when I tell them the story. They ask how I managed to be so prepared. They ask whether I had known from the beginning that it would end this way. The answer is that I had not known. But I had prepared as though I had. I had moved the things that mattered to me out of the flat over the previous 3 weeks. Not obviously, not in boxes or bags that would signal something was shifting. In the gradual, invisible way of someone adding a cardigan to their work bag and not bringing it back. A book. A document. The items of genuine personal significance that I could not afford to need to retrieve later. I stayed with my colleague Pris for the first week. Pris was the only person who had known what I was doing for the full 8 months. She had not asked questions I had not answered, and she had not offered opinions I had not sought, and she had provided the one thing I had needed more than anything else during the gathering phase. Steadiness. I arrived at her door on Wednesday evening with my bag and the specific expression of someone who has just done the most significant thing they have ever done and is still processing whether it was as real as it felt. She opened the door. She said, Done? I said, done. She made tea. We sat at her kitchen table until midnight. Caspian called 11 times on Thursday. I know the exact number because I counted them. Not because I was monitoring obsessively, because counting had become my way of managing the situation. Concrete numbers in place of the formless anxiety that might otherwise have occupied the same space. 11 calls. I answered none of them. He sent 4 messages. The first 2 were practical, asking where I was, asking me to call him, using the measured tone of someone who has not yet decided what register to operate in. The third message shifted. He said that what I had sent to the regulatory body was based on a misunderstanding of the documentation. He said the financial records I had cited were not what they appeared. He said I did not have the full picture. I read that message once. Then I saved it. Because a message from a man saying the documentation I had sent was based on a misunderstanding was, in the specific language of regulatory proceedings, a message that was going to be useful. The fourth message said he needed to talk to me. That everything could be explained. That I had acted without the full context and he wanted the opportunity to provide it. I did not reply to any of them. What I did instead was call my solicitor. A precise, experienced woman named Ms. Vance who had been expecting my call since the previous week when I had sent her the same documentation package I had sent to the regulatory body. She said, "How are you holding up?" I said, "Well, he has started messaging." She said, "Save everything." I said, "Already done." She said, "Good. Let him keep going." The first person outside my immediate circle to contact me was Griffin. He called on the Friday. I had been expecting contact from him eventually. The documentation I had sent his legal representative would have reached him, and Griffin was not the kind of person who received significant information without responding to it directly. He was careful on the call. Professional. He asked if I was the person who had sent the package. I confirmed I was. He said he appreciated it. He said he had been trying to establish certain things for 2 years, and that what I had sent provided documentation he had not been able to obtain himself. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, "You should know there are others." I said, "I know about the 2 colleagues." He said, "There are more than 2. I sat with that for a moment. He said he had been in contact with 4 other people over the previous year who had various versions of the same experience with Caspian. Some financial, some professional, some personal. People who had not come forward individually because they had each believed, had been told, in one form or another, that nobody would believe them. I said, "I know that feeling." He said, "Yes, but you did something about it. That changes the calculation for everyone else." I thanked him. We spoke for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, I had agreed to connect him with Ms. Vance, and he had agreed to share the contact information for the others, with their permission, so that what had been a collection of individual experiences could become a coordinated account. The regulatory body responded in the 3rd week. Ms. Vance called me on a Tuesday morning with the specific tone she used when news was significant but required careful handling. She said the body had received my documentation and had opened a preliminary inquiry. She said this did not mean a finding had been made, only that what I had sent was sufficient to warrant formal examination. She said, "How do you feel?" I said, "Relieved, and aware that this is the beginning, not the end." She said, "That is exactly the right way to feel." I asked what happened next. She explained the process with the thoroughness I had come to rely on. The inquiry would involve the body contacting relevant parties, including Caspian, who would be notified formally that an inquiry had been opened. He would have the opportunity to respond. The process would take time. I said, "How much time?" She said, "Months. Possibly longer." I said, "And in the meantime?" She said, "In the meantime you live your life. You do not discuss the specifics publicly. You save every communication from him. And you trust the process." I said, "I trust the documentation." She said, "So do they. That is why the inquiry was opened." I went back to work. I sat at my desk with the specific steadiness of someone who has done what can be done and is now required to wait. Waiting, I had learned, was its own kind of discipline. The compliance officer in me understood that the process had its own timeline and that impatience did not accelerate it. I waited. Caspian's version of events began circulating in the 4th week. I heard about it through Pris first, who heard through a mutual professional contact. Then through Ms. Vance, who had heard through Griffin's legal representative. Then through 3 separate industry contacts who reached out with the careful, oblique messages of people who are not sure what they know and are trying to find out more. His version was organized. I will give him that. He had a narrative, and he was deploying it with the specific consistency of someone who has constructed a story and intends to repeat it until it becomes the accepted account. The narrative positioned me as a disgruntled former partner who had misinterpreted financial documentation she did not have the full context for, who had acted impulsively from personal grievance, whose professional background in compliance had given her access to documents she had not understood correctly. He was telling this version to anyone who would listen. Former colleagues, industry contacts, people who knew us both from the professional world we had moved through together. I heard about each instance. I said nothing publicly in response to any of them. Pris asked me how I was managing the silence. I said, it is not silence. Everything is being said, just not by me. She said, what do you mean? I said, every time he tells his version, someone checks it against the documentation. And the documentation does not change. His version does, it shifts slightly each time depending on the audience. The documentation is the same every time. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, you have been planning this for a long time. I said, 8 months. Dara called in the 5th week. She was the investor I had sent the documentation to directly. A woman in her 50s who had built her own investment portfolio through 30 years of the specific kind of due diligence that I recognized and respected. She had been asking questions about Caspian's company for 6 months and had not been getting answers that satisfied her. She said, I received your package. I said, yes. She said, it answers several things I had not been able to establish. I said, I thought it might. She said, I need to ask you something directly. I said, ask. She said, is there anything else? Anything you have that is not in the package? I said, everything relevant is in the package. I documented everything relevant before I sent anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I have been in business for 30 years. I have dealt with a great many people who were not what they presented themselves as. This level of documentation, the organization of it, the sequence, is not what I expected from someone acting from personal grievance. I said, I was not acting from personal grievance. She said, I know that now. She paused. Then she said, I am withdrawing my investment. And I am going to tell 2 colleagues why. I said, that is your decision to make. She said, it is. I have made it. We ended the call. I sat at my desk and thought about the Wednesday evening. About the 5 words delivered in the certain tone of someone who has never been wrong about what people choose to believe. Nobody is going to believe you. Dara believed me. Griffin believed me. The regulatory body had opened an inquiry. And Caspian was spending every day of the 5th week telling a story that was shifting with each telling, while the documentation I had sent remained exactly the same. I want to tell you about the silence. Because I think the silence is the part of this story that people find most difficult to understand. They hear that I did not respond to his public narrative, that I did not issue counterstatements or speak to the industry contacts who called with their careful oblique questions or give any interview or make any public account of my own version of events. And they ask how I managed it. The answer is that I had understood something that Caspian had not. He believed the battle was about perception. About who could construct the more convincing narrative and deliver it to the most people before the other person had a chance to respond. He was wrong. The battle was about documentation. About what existed in writing and records, in the formal processes of bodies that were not interested in narratives, but in evidence. Every statement I made publicly was a statement that could be challenged, reframed, positioned as personal grievance or emotional reaction. Every statement the documentation made was a statement that existed in its own right, independent of me, requiring no defense and no delivery. I had sent the documentation before Wednesday evening. It was already in the hands of people who would examine it on its merits. My silence after Wednesday was not passivity. It was precision. The less I said, the more the documentation said. And the documentation was not going to change its story depending on the audience. The industry contact who reached out in the 7th week was the one I had not expected. His name was Tobias. He ran a property consultancy that had worked with Caspian's firm on several projects over the previous 4 years. He was known in the sector as careful and ethical and someone whose professional opinion carried significant weight. He said he was calling because he had heard my name in connection with a situation involving Caspian, and he wanted to hear from me directly before forming a view. I said, I appreciate that. He said, I have also received the regulatory inquiry notification. As a connected party. I said, then you have the documentation. He said, I have some of it. The portion relevant to the projects we worked on together. I said, and? He was quiet for a moment. He said, there are discrepancies between what I was told and what the records show. I said, yes. He said, I should have seen them myself. I am a careful person and I did not see them. I said, he is a skilled person. That is not a reflection of your capability. He said, perhaps. But I am going to need to make some statements to the inquiry that I would rather not have to make. I said, I understand. He said, I want you to know something. When I first heard your name in connection with this, I was told you had acted impulsively and without full understanding of the documentation. I said, I know what you were told. He said, I do not believe that anymore. I said, I know. He paused. Then he said, you are very calm. I said, I have been calm for 8 months. It is a practiced calm. 3 months after Wednesday evening, Caspian's version of events stopped circulating. Not dramatically. Not with a public announcement or a retraction. Simply stopped. The way something stops when the people repeating it have checked it against available information and found that the checking does not support the repetition. Tobias had made his statements to the inquiry. Griffin had made his. The 2 former colleagues had made theirs. Dara had provided her account. 3 additional people, the ones Griffin had connected me with, had provided accounts of their own experiences. The inquiry had more than documentation. It had a pattern. A pattern is different from an isolated incident. An isolated incident can be explained as a misunderstanding, a dispute, a matter of interpretation. A pattern is evidence of a practice. And a practice, documented across multiple parties over multiple years, is something that regulatory bodies take a very specific kind of interest in. Ms. Vance called me on a Thursday morning. She said, the inquiry has moved to the next stage. I said, which means? She said, which means they have found sufficient grounds to proceed formally. He will be notified today. I sat with that for a moment. I said, how is he likely to respond? She said, in my experience, people in this situation respond in one of 2 ways. They cooperate or they escalate. I said, he will escalate. She said, I think so too. Be prepared for that. I said, I have been prepared for 14 months. She said, I know. That is why we are at this stage. The escalation arrived in the form of a legal letter, delivered to Ms. Vance on a Monday morning. A letter from Caspian Solicitors, a firm with an aggressive reputation that he had clearly chosen for that reputation, alleging defamation and demanding that I retract what I had sent to the regulatory body and to the parties I had contacted directly. Ms. Vance called me immediately. She described the letter with the specific precision she brought to everything. Then she said, this is good news. I said, a legal threat is good news? She said, A legal threat that demands you retract documentation you have already submitted to a regulatory body in the middle of an active inquiry is good news. It tells us two things. First, that he is frightened. Second, that his legal team has made a significant error in judgment. I said, "What error?" She said, "You cannot defame someone with accurate documentation." And demanding a retraction of accurate documentation in writing during an active regulatory inquiry is going to be very interesting for the inquiry to examine. I said, "He has made it worse for himself." She said, "Considerably." "I will respond today." She responded that day. I did not see the letter she sent. She described it to me afterward as comprehensive and said that Caspian's legal team had not responded to it. They did not respond for 6 weeks. By then the inquiry had moved again. I want to tell you about the call I received in the 4th month. From a woman named Sable. She had heard about the situation through a professional contact and had my number through a chain of people I could trace. She was careful on the call, cautious in the way of someone who has information and is not yet sure whether sharing it is safe. She said, "I need to ask you something before I say anything." I said, "Ask." She said, "Is what you submitted to the inquiry accurate?" I said, "Completely." She said, "And are you protected? Legally?" I said, "Yes. My solicitor has handled everything." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was with him before you. 2 years before you. And something happened at the end of that relationship that I have never been able to do anything about because I did not have what you apparently have." I said, "Documentation." She said, "Yes." I said, "Tell me what happened." She told me. It took 40 minutes. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "With your permission, I would like to connect you with my solicitor." She said, "I was hoping you would say that." I called Ms. Vance that afternoon. She called Sable that evening. 2 days later, Sable had provided a formal account to the inquiry. The pattern had become longer and more documented. And Caspian's version of events, which had positioned me as a single disgruntled former partner acting from personal grievance, had become impossible to sustain. 5 months after Wednesday evening, I ran into a former colleague of Caspian's at a professional event. A man named Edmund who had worked with Caspian in the early years of the company and whose departure had been explained to me, at the time, as a mutual decision made for professional reasons. Edmund looked at me across the room. He came over. He said, "I heard what you did." I said, "Which part?" He said, "All of it. The documentation. The inquiry. The legal letter that went nowhere." I said, "Yes." He said, "I want you to know something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I tried to say something 4 years ago. When I left the company. There were things I had seen that I reported to a professional body. It went nowhere. I was told the documentation was insufficient and the account was uncorroborated." He paused. He said, "I have been contacted by the inquiry. They want to speak to me about what I reported 4 years ago in light of the current documentation." I said, "And you will speak to them?" He said, "Yes. I have been waiting 4 years for there to be a case strong enough that speaking would matter." I said, "There is a case now." He said, "I know. You built it." I stood with that sentence for a moment. I had not built it for Edmund or for Sable or for Griffin or for the investors or for the industry. I had built it because I was a compliance officer who had lived inside a situation that violated everything her profession had taught her to identify and address. And because doing nothing had stopped being an option the moment I heard a voice through a garden window on a Tuesday afternoon. But it had become something larger than what I had built it to be. That mattered in a way I had not anticipated. The formal finding came in the 9th month. Ms. Vance called me on a Wednesday morning. I noted the day, Wednesday again. Bookending things. She said, "The inquiry has completed its examination. The finding has been issued." I said, "And?" She said, "Significant regulatory violations across multiple areas. Financial misrepresentation to investors. Conduct prejudicial to the integrity of the industry. The finding will be published formally and will result in restrictions on his ability to operate in the sector. She described the specifics precisely and completely. When she finished, I said, "And the legal threat? The defamation letter?" She said, "Withdrawn." Quietly. 3 weeks ago. I was waiting to tell you until there was other news to tell you alongside it. I said, "He withdrew it." She said, "His legal team withdrew it." There is a difference. But yes. I sat at my desk and looked at the wall of my office. The place where I had sat for 9 months doing the ordinary work of my job while the other work, the careful, patient, 8-month of gathering work, had moved through its process. I said, "Nobody was going to believe me." Ms. Vance said, "I beg your pardon?" I said, something he said. On the last night. He said nobody was going to believe me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Riva." 7 people gave formal accounts to that inquiry. 3 of them had tried to raise concerns previously and been unable to proceed without the documentation you provided. You gave them a case strong enough to be heard. She paused. She said, "A great many people believed you." What happened to Caspian in the year after Wednesday evening was something I observed from a distance rather than participated in. I want to be precise about that. I did not monitor his situation with satisfaction or attention. I knew what the inquiry had found because Ms. Vance had told me. I knew what the professional restrictions meant because I understood the regulatory framework. Beyond that, I had made a deliberate decision not to follow what was happening to him because following it would have required me to keep him at the center of my attention, and my attention had better things to occupy it. What I know is this. The formal finding was published in the regulatory body's public record, available to anyone who searched his name in connection with the sector. The kind of record that follows a professional through every subsequent application, every subsequent pitch, every subsequent attempt to rebuild in the same space. 2 of the investors he had misrepresented pursued civil claims. Dara was one of them. His firm's remaining projects were taken over by a management company appointed by the investors. 14 members of staff had to find new positions. He sold the flat we had shared. I know this because Pris saw the listing. And the narrative he had spent the months after Wednesday evening constructing and delivering to anyone who would listen, the narrative of the disgruntled former partner who had misunderstood documentation she did not have full context for. That narrative had nowhere to go. The people he had told it to had since received other information. More reliable information. Information that existed in documents rather than in his telling of it. He spent a year trying to explain himself to everyone who had believed me. I spent that year living. Pris asked me in the 11th month what the year had cost me. We were at dinner. A proper dinner, the kind that takes an evening and involves good food and the conversation that happens when 2 people know each other well enough that nothing has to be managed. She asked it directly, which was her way. Pris had always asked the direct question that other people left unasked. I thought about it honestly. I said, 8 months of carrying something very heavy completely alone. That was the hardest part. Not the Wednesday evening or the legal threat or the months of his narrative circulating. The 8 months of knowing and not saying. She said, "Why did you not tell me earlier?" I said, "Because telling anyone was a variable I could not control. Every person who knew was a person who might inadvertently say something or change their behavior around him in a way he would notice. The 8 months only worked because it was invisible. And it could only be invisible if nobody knew." She said, "That must have been lonely." I said, "Profoundly." She said, "And now?" I thought about now. About the finding and the withdrawal of the legal threat and the year that had happened on the other side of Wednesday evening. I said, "Now I feel the thing I was not able to feel during the 8 months. The thing I kept in a container because there was no room for it while the work was being done." She said, "What thing?" I said, "Grief. For the year I lost. For the version of the relationship that I believed in before the Tuesday afternoon in the garden. For the specific sadness of having loved someone who was not what they presented and not knowing how not to have loved them anyway." Pris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a human thing to feel." I said, "Yes, it is." I went back to the flat once. Not to collect anything. Not to see him. He was not there. He had moved out months before. The flat had been listed and sold and was being renovated by the new owners. I stood on the pavement outside for a few minutes. I thought about the garden. The window. The voice through it on a Tuesday afternoon that had changed the trajectory of everything. I thought about the compliance officer who had woken up completely in that garden and had spent 8 months doing what she was trained to do. I thought about Wednesday evening. The living room. The 5 words. Nobody is going to believe you. I thought about the 7 people who had given formal accounts. About Griffin and Sable and Edmund and Dara and the others. About the regulatory finding published in a public record. About Ms. Vance saying a great many people believed you on a Wednesday morning 9 months after the first Wednesday. I stood on the pavement for a few more minutes. Then I walked away. Not with triumph. Not with the specific satisfaction of someone who has watched an enemy fall. With the particular quietness of a person who has done something significant and is now ready to do something else. The year was over. The work was done. What came next was mine. I returned to the professional world fully in the month after the finding. Not that I had left it, I had worked throughout, maintaining the ordinary structure of my days with the deliberate consistency of someone who understood that visible disruption was information she could not afford to provide. But returning fully meant something different from maintaining appearances. It meant showing up in the specific way of someone who has nothing to manage and nothing to conceal and is simply present in their own professional life without the parallel weight of everything else. I took on a new project. A complex one, the kind my manager had been offering for months and that I had been deferring because the parallel work had occupied too much of the energy that complex projects require. I took it on in the month after the finding, and I worked on it with the full, unencumbered attention of someone who has put down a very heavy thing. The project was the best work of my career. Not because the circumstances had made me better. Because the year had returned me to myself, to the compliance officer who noticed discrepancies other people missed, who documented with precision, who understood that evidence was more durable than narrative. Those qualities had always been there. The year had simply required them in a context that made them impossible to ignore. I had been using them on myself as much as on anything external. Documenting my own capability. Building a case for the version of myself that existed underneath the year. The project was what happened when that version had nothing else to work on but the work. Edmund called me 14 months after Wednesday evening. He said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Tell me." He said, "I spoke to the inquiry for 4 hours. I told them everything I had been unable to tell anyone 4 years ago. And when I walked out, I felt something I had not felt since before I left the company." I said, "What did you feel?" He said, "Heard." 1 word. The most complete answer to the most complicated question. He said, "You gave 7 people that. 7 people who had been told in one way or another that their account would not be enough. That nobody would believe them. You gave them a case strong enough that the telling mattered." I said, "I gave them documentation." He said, "Yes. But documentation does not find people. You found them. Or they found you because of what you did." I sat with that. He said, "I know you are not looking for acknowledgement. I know this was not about acknowledgement." I said, "No, it was not." He said, "I know. That is why I am giving it anyway." We talked for a while longer. About the sector. About what had changed and what would take longer to change. About the particular difficulty of raising concerns in professional environments where the person concerned has built their reputation carefully and the concerned party has to decide whether the cost of raising them is worth the outcome. I said, "It is worth it if the documentation is sufficient." He said, "Yes. And the documentation is only sufficient if someone builds it." I said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you for building it." The thing I think about most, in the time since, is not the finding or the legal letter or the 7 accounts or Caspian's narrative that ran out of road. It is the Tuesday afternoon in the garden. The moment when the compliance officer in me woke up and understood that she had been applying her training everywhere except the place that mattered most. Because here is the thing about that moment that I did not understand until much later. I had been trained to notice discrepancies, to document, to build a case from evidence rather than assumption, to resist the pressure to act before the case was complete. Those were professional skills. But they were also, it turned out, the skills for surviving the specific kind of person who relies on other people not having them. The kind of person who operates on the assumption that their victims will react from emotion rather than evidence. Who believes that the speed and visibility of their counter-narrative will outrun any response. Caspian had spent years operating in an environment where that assumption was correct. He had never encountered a compliance officer standing in a garden. He had never encountered someone who heard a voice through a window and did not react immediately, but instead went inside and made tea and started building an 8-month case in the spaces between ordinary life. He had never encountered someone who received the 5 words as strategic information rather than a defeat. Nobody is going to believe you. I had heard those words and understood them as a map. A map of what he believed his protection was. And then I had spent 8 months systematically removing every element of that protection before he knew I was doing it. People ask me sometimes what I would say to someone who has been told that nobody will believe them. I would say, that sentence is information, not a verdict. Information about what the person saying it believes their protection consists of. And then I would say, documentation is the answer to that sentence. Not argument. Not public counter-narrative. Not the visible, emotional, reactive response that the person saying it is counting on. Patient, precise, invisible documentation. I would say, you do not have to be a compliance officer. You do not need professional training. You need to understand one thing, that accurate evidence, gathered carefully, exists independently of the person who gathered it. It does not need you to defend it. It does not shift depending on who is in the room. It is the same every time someone looks at it regardless of what the other person is saying in the meantime. I would say, find the people who have the authority to examine what you have gathered. Not the public, not the industry gossip network, not the people the other person has already reached. The people whose job it is to examine evidence and form a finding based on it. And I would say, the silence is not weakness. The silence is precision. Every word you do not say publicly is a word that cannot be used against you. Every word the documentation says is a word that stands on its own. My name is Riva. I was told by someone I loved that nobody would ever believe me. I did not say a word. He spent the next year trying to explain himself to everyone who did. The documentation did not change its story. It never does.